Welcome to the AFGHANEYE YouTube channel. If this is your first visit, make sure to subscribe and press the notification bell so that you won't miss any of our new videos. Assalamu alaikum. Welcome to another AFGHANEYE Live. I'm your host Sangar Paikar, and in this episode we are hosting British journalist and author Yvonne Ridley. Yvonne has extensive experience writing about war and terror. She spent some time in Afghanistan, and along with me we have today Pashtana, who was our guest yesterday. Yvonne and Pashtana, welcome to the AFGHANEYE Live.
Thank you.
Thank you for having me again.
Okay, so I think most of our audience already know who you are, Yvonne. We have received many requests from our audience to invite you. But for those of us who don't know, could you please briefly introduce yourself and tell us a little bit about your background?
Well, I came to prominence when I was arrested by the Taliban in September 2001 for entering the country illegally without a passport and visa. They thought I was some sort of super American spy. They didn't recognize my accent, which is from the northeast of England. They thought we all spoke like the Queen. And so I was investigated and eventually released on humanitarian grounds. So they held on to other Westerners, Australians, Germans and Americans, and they couldn't wait to get rid of me.
Okay, and have you traveled back to Afghanistan in the last 2 decades?
I have. I've been back quite a few times. I've bumped into my captors inadvertently, and I've even been shot at by them in Paktia province, but you can't take these things personally. And yes, I've been back to Afghanistan many times.
Okay, so Pashtana wanted to ask you about your recent article. So please, Pashtana, go ahead.
Yeah, thank you again, Yvonne, for joining us. And I have many questions. I read your article, the recent 3 articles that you read, that you wrote, and great job covering many things that a lot of us in the diaspora have as questions. There was actually, before we kind of went into that, I wanted to ask a question that I noticed that was actually it kind of relates to what you shared earlier in regards to when you were held captive. And, a lot of people are wondering, I think what you shared in your one of your writings was that when you were released, it was because you were told that you have to look into Islam or read more about Islam, and then and only then they'll release you. And some would look at that and still see that as a form of, being harsh or enforcement and kind of further proving the narrative of the Taliban that they're forceful individuals and that they're forcing religion. What would you say to someone who would ask you that?
Well, they invited me to embrace Islam, and I said I couldn't make such a life-changing decision while I was in prison, but if they let me go, I promised that I would study the Quran and supporting Islamic literature. And as I say, against all the odds, while they held on to other Westerners, they let me go. And I went on to read about Islam and read the Holy Quran, an English translation. Obviously, I don't speak Arabic. And subsequently, 2 years later, I ended up embracing Islam, which naturally the Taliban claimed was because it was down to them, when in fact it wasn't. It was down to the beauty of Islam.
SubhanAllah. Wonderful. And you shared that you were held in prison. And can you tell us maybe a little bit about that? I know I do want to go into your article because you have wonderful points there, and I do want to get into women's rights. But just to give a little bit of context for the viewers, if you can share just a little bit about, you know, when you were held captive, what was that like? Because some others would actually, you know, say that what if Yvonne has Stockholm syndrome?
I do smile when people say, oh, she's suffering from Stockholm syndrome, which is when you bond with your captors and start believing what they're telling you. Anybody who was in Jalalabad for those first 6 days, I was held in the intelligence headquarters and questioned. Anyone will tell you that I adopted this very strange strategy. I was the prisoner from hell. I spat at them, I swore at them, I threw things at them, and they kept saying to me, why are you so angry? You are here as our guest. We want you to be happy. And I'm looking at these guys thinking, why are you trying to be nice? You know, I know that you're evil and brutal and you hate women. But throughout the 6 days in Jalalabad, and then I was moved to the terrorist wing of Kabul Central Prison and held up there for 5 days. Throughout that whole period, they never touched me. They never threatened me other than to say if I didn't answer their questions honestly, I would be held in prison for 20 years. And I remember saying, trust me, you'll get sick long before I do.
That was a clash of the Scottish and Afghan characters.
Absolutely. You know, it was a total clash of cultures. I swept into Afghanistan without the passport, without the visa, full of Western arrogance and ignorance, really, and they sort of arrested me, and of course their culture just totally clashed with mine. And any prejudices they held about Western women were reinforced, really, by my bad behaviour. And when they did let me go, and this is a one for all of those who say Stockholm syndrome, when they did let me go, Mullah Zaif, who was the Taliban's ambassador in Islamabad, held a press conference, and he said, we're letting the English woman go. She's a very bad woman with a very bad mouth. And in all honesty, when I crossed the border over no man's land back into Pakistan, I don't know who was happiest, me or them, you know, just to see the back of me. They really, you know, in fact, some of them are probably being counselled still from the experience.
And just to kind of, thank you for sharing that. Again, one point that you did share was being an English, you know, being a British woman, and they shared that, they highlighted that point. Do you feel that in any form, the fact that, you know, you were a journalist, you are someone of a background of privilege, you are someone who's, you know, white, you're white, you know, overtly and by the definition, do you feel like that played a role in the treatment? And perhaps it could have been something like, okay, we're holding her captive, and then maybe she can go back and share some positive news about us so that we look like we're not as bad as we've seen. But actually, in reality, majority of them are, you know, these harsh men that are brutal and bad to women.
I certainly, looking back, I certainly was given quite a lot of slack for my bad behaviour. I don't think that they would have tolerated that sort of behaviour from an Afghan woman. But when I was put in the prison in Kabul, they seemed to have quite a good relationship with the Americans, Australians and Germans who were also held with me. They were the charity workers who had been accused of trying to convert Muslims to Christianity. And, they had been charged under Sharia law and were facing quite an ordeal. But they had a very good relationship with the Afghan prison officers.
So you bring up a really good point, Yvonne, which takes me now to current times. So thank you for giving our viewers context who don't know so much about the background. You mentioned Sharia law. So when we hear about the future of Afghanistan, we have this Sharia law term circulating. And this really ties into the situation of women's rights and how women are being treated back home. As you know, times are becoming more modern. There's a rise of feminism, and with feminism, there's also a shift in the roles of women and from the traditional norms that we see in Sharia law. So from your perspective, again, let's acknowledge the fact that we're not there, so we don't really know how to relate with women that are truly there and their experiences. But just from your perspective, is there even room in the future of Afghanistan with the Taliban and the Sharia law and feminism and modernization and equality and things like that?
I do believe that there is. And, people say, oh, I couldn't live under Sharia law. There are hundreds of thousands of Westerners living under Sharia law in Saudi, in Qatar, in the UAE. All those people who go on holiday to the UAE, they're all, they're not aware of it, but they are all living under Sharia law. And it only becomes obvious when they transgress or something happens and they end up being arrested. So I think it's quite possible. I'm not saying it would really suit me, but, living under Boris Johnson in Britain doesn't suit me either. So I think that this Taliban, Mark II, should we call them, has more wisdom, is more media savvy, and is much more mature and ready to govern. I mean, let's face it, their first attempt in the 90s was an absolute disaster, but they didn't have ambitions to govern at the time. It was sort of, pushed upon them, and they got into this momentum of going through Afghanistan and bringing some form of security and stability. And before they knew it, they were in government and they weren't prepared. And they came out with some really crazy decisions. They've had 20 years to think about that period of time. And in those 20 years, I think they've realized the errors that they made. The one thing that they haven't done is dilute their Islam. And, they're still very puritanical in their outlook. They're still conservative with a small c. But I really despair at some of the reports that we've seen comparing them to ISIS or Daesh. The behavior of ISIS, raping and selling and enslaving Yazidi women and the brutality that they meted out. I think that the Taliban would have been quite shocked and distressed by what these people were doing. And I'm quite confident that once they do, or if they do get in a position to fully govern Afghanistan, there will be no room at all for any extreme groups like that.
Yvonne, you bring up a point. One thing that I noticed that you shared is that they had made errors in the past. Now, when we look at those errors, for a lot of people here in the diaspora and people that are there back home, these errors are not very minor things to gloss over, right? They're enough to where it's created real trauma, real fears, and rightfully so, to where a lot of people cannot just accept and say, okay, we have Taliban 2.0, let's bring it on, right? So a lot of people are really clinging on to those experiences. I myself am a therapist, right? So from a mental health perspective, you know, when it comes into PTSD and things like that, it's not a very simple thing for us to just tell people you're going to be okay, calm down. It takes a lot of effort, a lot of, digestion for people. So when you talk about errors, if you can first kind of tell us a little bit about those errors, and how do we know from an operationalized lens that those errors have come into light, that it will be changed? How do we actually provide proof for people that from that? Because we are hearing from people back home that, still women are not, I can't say it's valid. I can't say these are true sources because there's a lot of propaganda, but we are being told, in fact, that no, we're seeing glimpses of Taliban from the past happening right now, where women are not necessarily able to go to work, or they're selected that they can only be teachers or doctors and not anything else. If you can please shed light on that.
Well, I know as much as you. I've seen the images on TV. I've seen this. It's on a roll. It's shown every few minutes of some guy with a paint spray spraying over the face of a beautician's advert. Now, I remember at the time of the fall of Kabul, journalists were paying women to burn their burqas and were paying men up to $50 to shave their beards, which seemed like quite a bargain, I guess. $50 for shaving your beard off. And that's why we had extraordinary scenes when the Taliban had left of all this burqa burning and beard shaving. So I'm skeptical when I see images on television. I'm not saying it's not true, but I'm skeptical. I saw a fellow journalist who I hugely respect, and I was really distressed to see her in front of Taliban soldiers who were shouting takbir, and they were responding Allahu Akbar. And she said directly to the camera, oh, they've just said death to America. And they didn't say that at all. I thought, I just thought, what are you playing at? Why are you being like this? And it was just really sad. So treat everything that you see with great caution until it's corroborated and until you're certain. I'm not underestimating the fear out there. We saw the shocking scenes in the airport. Those people were scared. Whether they had any reason to be or not, they were scared. And I've seen that fear before. I felt it when I was held for 11 days by the Taliban. Because the propaganda, I had believed that this was the most evil, brutal regime in the world. That's what George Bush and Tony Blair were telling us. And the fear was all up here. But for those whole 11 days, I was terrified of them. And I saw that fear from the people in the airport who, just wanted to get out any way possible. And of course we saw it all the chaos ensue and people dying so unnecessarily, and that poor young boy who was a member of the Afghan football team who plunged from the undercarriage to his death. It was just awful. So the fear is there. We're hearing these stories. The trouble is with the Taliban, because, as you know, the country is run along tribal lines, some will behave and follow orders under the leadership, and others will go their own way and behave badly until they are checked. So it's very hard to know what is propaganda, what are downright lies, and what is the truth. And I keep hearing that, the Taliban are knocking on different doors of people who had collaborated with the occupation or perceived to have collaborated. And it's been repeated so often, you have to wonder, well, maybe there is a grain of truth.
Absolutely. I definitely wanted to kind of go off of something that you shared, which was interesting to me in your article, is, kind of looking back, you mentioned the occupation, you mentioned the 20 years of occupation. So here in our diaspora, we have a lot of protests, Yvonne, here in California, around the world, and a lot of people are very emotional, right? And they're chanting and saying, anti-Taliban remarks, which, again, how you shared errors, these errors are very profound for these individuals. They're not very minor for them, right? They have people back home who've gone through real trauma, real things that have been at the hands of the Taliban. So they're protesting and they're saying anti-Taliban things. But then when you ask them, are you pro-occupation? They'll say no, but it seems like people actually believe, and maybe you can shed light on this, that that with the occupation, there was actual progression, and that we were almost reaching a pivotal point. And what happened was the Taliban came and ruined that. It's kind of like we were almost at a point of education, good infrastructure. So if you can kind of shed light on, you did say in your article, the literacy rate. You said 84% of women are illiterate, and you said 2% have access to higher education. You can kind of tell us a little bit about that.
Well, I can understand people being triggered and getting very emotional, and especially when it comes to education and women's rights. And for the last few years, all we've been told is we are putting women's rights at the front of the agenda. Tony Blair and George Bush, both their wives held simultaneous press conferences saying our husbands are going into Afghanistan to liberate the Afghan woman. That's what we were told. The excuses for invading Afghanistan kept changing, and one of them was for liberating the Afghan women. Well, it was all cosmetic, because you look at the literacy figures now, and it doesn't matter how much lipstick you put on this pig, it's still a pig. 84% of Afghan women cannot read. And that is a fact. Now, I was discussing this on the social networks with a very passionate, intelligent, bright, young Afghan woman, and she just refused to accept that. And I said, but these are figures from the Ashraf Ghani government. This is an extensive study that went out to all the provinces, major towns, right down to villages, and tens of thousands of people took part in this survey, and she said it's rubbish. She's just in total denial. And it's very hard for me, because I'm not an Afghan woman, and I find it very difficult to argue with Afghan women, because, if they should know their country better than an outsider. But the figures speak for themselves. And also it emerged that 2% of Afghan women will get a chance at further education. So I started looking at this further. One thing that I really have to tear down straight away, and that is the myth that girls weren't educated under the Taliban. And I say that because I returned to Afghanistan with the BBC Radio 4 in February, March 2002, when Kabul University was opening its gates for the first time since the fall of the Taliban. and more girls than boys passed the entrance exam. And there was a big press conference and they were making such a big deal of this. And I put my hand up and said, how did so many girls pass the entrance exam if they weren't educated under the Taliban? And I was almost shot down and said, well, you know, we don't want any negativity. This is a great day today. The university is opening. But that was a valid question. Now, I've since spoken to people who raised funds and helped build girls' schools under the Taliban. I'm not saying it was a great system, you know, decades of war, famine and strife. They're not going to have the money to have a school building program. However, the US occupation and the NATO forces and the countries representing them did have the money to rebuild Afghanistan. And so you have to wonder, 20 years of saying this is for the Afghan woman, what is going wrong with the education system? Why isn't it being turned around? And I started going back into history, trying to find comparable statistics. And I came across, well, he's dead now, that old rogue Robert Mugabe, who was the leader of Zimbabwe. Awful man. But one of the things that he did in the first 2 decades of Zimbabwe's inception was completely invest so heavily in the education system that women from Zimbabwe had the highest literacy rates in the whole of Africa. And it was something, the nation as a whole has 89% adult, you know, literacy rates, which is astonishing. So if an old rogue like Mugabe can turn his country around, why couldn't the whole of Europe, the Australia, New Zealand, North America, probably South America, all the money that came tumbling in, why have they achieved so little in education? There are green shoots of hope, and it would be churlish of me not to recognize it, but all those women who are highly educated are mainly from the elite areas, the privileged areas. They can speak perfect English. They make great guests for the mainstream media and project this image of the Afghan woman and, you know, how lucky we are and we're liberated and now the nasty Taliban are coming in and they're going to take it all away. These women are a large vocal minority of Afghan women, I would suggest. The real face of the Afghan women are the likes of this wretched girl, and my heart breaks for her, called Lal Bibi, who was forced into a marriage that she didn't want by her parents. And when she went to live with her in-laws, she was abused horribly by her husband and father-in-law. They burnt her, they kicked her, they pulled out her fingernails. They really brutalized this girl until she was an absolute shell. And when her father found her and took her away, she was in a wheelchair. She's now being rehabilitated. But the local police it was reported to them, and the police went and arrested the father-in-law and the son. And so that's great, you know, justice working. But as soon as they arrested them and put them into the police cell, pending the investigation, the local thugs and warlords came around and said, release those men. And they had to release the men, who then ran off and sought refuge in a Taliban-controlled area where they knew they were safe from government forces. So this was happening under Ashraf Ghani. And to me, Lal Bibi is a woman who doesn't have a voice. She can't speak English. She hasn't been formally educated. She'll never get a chance of going to university. And you know, who's shouting for her? Who is standing up for Lal Bibi and all the other young girls, women in Afghanistan who are, you know, like me? I come from a working class background, who come from poor backgrounds, from the villages. And who's speaking for them? Who's standing up for them? Because I don't see the Afghan elite doing it, and I don't hear anybody on these marches shouting about Lal Bibi.
Yvonne, that brings a good point, actually, from what you're sharing, and it makes me think of another question that, because you're sharing that this was under Ghani's regime, and you know what we're hearing about Taliban is that it's because of Sharia or because of the way that they're governing. Would you say, from your perspective, that this has to do with the people, just by how they are as a people, or would you say this is linked to how they're being governed? Because as you even shared in the beginning, there's some good Taliban that, you know, they were very gracious with you, the best treatment. And then we do hear about some Taliban that have mistreatment that's enough to ruin the name for the entire group and for no one to have to deal with them. So what would you say? Would it come from the higher ups? Does it have to do with the way they're governing? Where does this come from?
It comes from right across the board. It comes from civil society. You know, all those bright young girls who are graduating from Kabul University and the other universities, I would say, remember, human rights and women's rights are for everyone, from the farmer's wife and the farmer's kids, right up to the politicians' daughters. And this hasn't happened. The other thing that concerns me, under the Ashraf Ghani government, these virginity tests. How on earth is that? You know, how was that allowed into law, and how is it still in Afghan law? These virginity tests, which have absolutely no bearing on criminal cases. There are no validity at all. And I'm thinking, come on, empowered women, why are you putting up with this? And you know, they're screaming and shouting and taking to the streets and being very courageous, by the way, with the arrival of the Taliban. But where was that anger? Where was that courage when Ashraf Ghani's government brought in these nonsense laws? I'm hoping that the Taliban are as good as their word when it comes to women's rights. And I hope that they scrap these virginity tests. And I hope that they find those two men who made Lal Bibi's life such a misery. And you know, if the Taliban do not stick to their promises and pledges, they will never be forgiven.
Yvonne, with that being said, it makes me wonder, well, why were the women over there protesting? You know, I've heard from a few friends here that when the Taliban have come recently, that they're kind of protecting their girls. And so there's some sort of a fear that there will be forced marriages. So the narrative we're hearing here in Western media is sex slaves. We're having things circulating about that, whereas we're reframing it in Afghanistan, they're saying it's forced marriages. So you know, and women are protesting. So where's that coming from? Where's that feeling coming from?
Well, again, those women are fearful, real or imagined, that they are going to lose the liberties that they are enjoying in Kabul at the moment. And so, you know, that's why they're protesting, because it involves them. But, you know, I would like to see them protesting for all Afghan women, the women in the villages who haven't had a chance to be educated, the women in the villages who are entering into forced marriages and you know, this isn't the business of forced marriages. It's unfortunately is an aspect of Afghan culture, and the life for most Afghan women is very tough.
Absolutely. Go ahead. Sangar, you're on mute.
Sangar, you're on mute.
Okay, I'm sorry for that. So, Yvonne, what you just said about the cultural aspect of forced marriage, which is a very big problem in Afghanistan, we know that that problem exists, but then there are these other stories that are being circulated in the media, very shocking, disturbing stories about women being sold in groups to other parts. They're even saying that women are being exported to Pakistan and sold in Pakistan, and similar very, very scary stories. Now, with your extended experience in journalism, can you help us and say how can we, as people who are based in Europe, North America, the United Kingdom or Australia, how can we treat these news stories as the truth or merely propaganda, or they're just rumors? What should be our attitude, and how can we as normal citizens, normal people who may not have extended experience in journalism, approach these topics like they are in the headlines? So what should we do?
I think that we have to adopt a healthy skepticism over any story at the moment coming out of Afghanistan, whether it's pro-Taliban or anti-Taliban. We have to seek corroboration. An early picture story that came out the day after the Taliban press conference was a man leading 3 women in chains through the streets. The chains had been photoshopped onto the women. The original photograph was traced back to a photograph taken by Reuters in Iraq. And it wasn't even, you know, it had no connection with Afghanistan. But some nasty little individual took this picture of these 3 women, photoshopped chains onto their ankles, and put it up and said, 24 hours in charge, and this is what's happening on the streets of Kabul. We're told that there are very few women on the streets of Kabul at the moment. I'm not surprised. If my country had just been taken over, there's no way my mother would let me out on the streets until, you know, let's find out which way the wind's blowing, don't go out, just stay in, keep your head down. When there is a transition of power, most sensible people do stay off work, do stay at home, do wait until they can work out, is it safe? Is law and order restored, or is it going to go crazy? So that's why the streets are quiet. There was another reporter talking about the amount of Islamic dress in evidence And I thought, yes, because you're in a Muslim country, you stupid man. You know, just some of the things that they're coming out with, you know, I really despair. As far as I'm aware, you know, there weren't people parading around in miniskirts and bikinis in Kabul last week or the last year or 5 years ago. So I can understand the fear, I can understand the anger, I can even understand the propaganda. But what I would say to everyone, just hold back on your on what you're seeing unfold on TV. And some of the biggest lies can be promoted on TV, like the journalist standing in front of the Taliban soldiers. They're shouting Allahu Akbar, and she's saying, and they're saying death to America. And you can imagine all the Americans going, oh my God, you know, and they're listening to her and not listening to what the crowd are really shouting.
So
Yvonne?
I have a question.
Sorry.
I have a question, and it's a question for both of you guys. So hello to everyone that's watching. I noticed a couple of people in the live chat asked where I am. I am here. I'm the moderator on the chat, but you know, for logistical purposes, it's not possible to get me on the screen. But in any case, we have a question from Suzanne Schroeder, who is a guest on one of our previous podcast episodes, and she says, a question for Yvonne. Yesterday, a friend who was a long-time aid worker in Afghanistan posted about meeting rural women whose bodies were so bent from heavy work that they could barely stand up to shake her hand. When she returned to Kabul, she found it difficult to reconcile listening to excited young women talking about starting a fashion magazine. Could both guests speak about the very difficult question of a universal standard of women's rights versus cultural differences with feminism? Thank you. Would you want me to repeat just the question one more time?
No, I fully understood that, Ahmed. And, you know, I've been a feminist all my life, and yet I find that I'm clashing over with other feminists over the issue of the Taliban. And I have to say to them, so, you know, I can't understand any woman supporting a misogynistic, imperialistic occupation. There's nothing feminist about that at all. And as I said before, when it comes to women's rights in Afghanistan, this isn't Animal Farm. You know, some people are more equal than others. All women should be equal. And while those young women are celebrating their fashion magazine, that's great. But yank their chains and just say, what about the women who are bent double because of hard labor in the fields? They're women too. They cut and bleed just like everyone else. And there's no reason why the freedoms and liberties being enjoyed by the girls in Kabul can't filter down into the towns and villages. So I can understand the frustration of that aid worker. And I spoke to another aid worker just today, and she said that the problems suffered by the poor and dispossessed in Afghanistan bear no relation to the lifestyles being enjoyed in upscale areas in Kabul or Kandahar.
Are there any other questions in the chat, Waleed? I think okay. Maybe.
Sorry, I've muted
yeah.
myself by default, but no, not that I'm aware of. But we have received a £5 super chat from Bilalovic saying, You are a fresh and original voice, countering the propaganda machine narrative of the West and paid bots of India spreading misinformation. Thank you very much, Bilalovich. And I'm going to go back to muting myself. I can also see Shaira Karimi in the live chat as well. So hello there, Shaira Karimi. And I'm just going to sort of disappear once again into muting myself.
Okay. Okay. Pashtana, you mentioned that there is a previous article of Yvonne that was worth mentioning. Could you maybe discuss that as well?
I think her original one that came out when things were really hot and fresh was a very good article. I shared that one just in general, discussing how it was inevitable for the Taliban to come back, and you kind of went over the infrastructure and the occupation. But I did actually have a question. I did notice that one thing that wasn't discussed, which is very common right now in what's trending, is sanction Pakistan. And I did notice that in your articles, you didn't really go too much into Pakistan. And we're also hearing from a lot of Afghans that, okay, yeah, sure, United States left our country, but we're still occupied and we still have an invasion, and that invasion is Pakistan. Do you have any thoughts on that?
Well, one of the worst kept secrets that's still denied by everybody is Pakistan's huge support and involvement with the Taliban. And I have, over the years, been involved in hostage negotiations with senior members of the Taliban, and they confirmed to me that they were reliant on goodwill from Pakistan. And I expressed surprise at this, because I said, well, I understood that ahead of the bombing, when the Americans were saying, hand over Osama bin Laden, one of your senior members of the Quetta Shura had turned around and been quite vocal with the ISI, the Pakistan intelligence wing, and said, go and eat dollars with Musharraf. And I said, I thought that there was quite a hostility there. And I was told, yes, well, that's when we had our own country. We are not running our own country at the moment. And so we're basically relying on goodwill from a lot of different people. So that was quite interesting. But as I say, it's the world's worst kept secret that there have been back channels from Pakistan. But I think a stable Afghanistan would be productive for relations between both Pakistan and Afghanistan. And I know that there's a lot of, not rivalry, I think it's hostility at times between both countries. But when you consider that the former or the old NWFP province spills right over into Afghanistan, there's a lot more that unites the two countries than divides. And the other thing is, I think that the Pakistan leader Imran Khan is a lot more pro-Afghan than other leaders have been. And I think that it's probably in the interest of both countries that, some peace and harmony breaks out, because that great long border is extremely porous. And it's a headache for the Pakistan military, because they've got India pressing on the other border with occupied Kashmir. And so it would be in everyone's interests if there was productive, harmonious relations between the two countries. But what is interesting is there have been lots of tweets that have been pushed out in their thousands and pushing out fake news, and they have been traced back to India. Now, India really doesn't, it isn't productive for India to see Afghanistan and Pakistan have good relations. It's not in their interests at all. And you know, that's something else to consider. I just hope that Afghanistan, whoever's running it, is allowed to govern, and that this great game which has been going on since the Victorian days just comes to an end, because, you know, Afghans must be sick of having proxy wars fought on their lands. But one of the things that the Taliban apparently have been doing, as well as securing goodwill on the ground in the countryside, one of the things that they've been doing is forging relations with outside countries, which is something they didn't do before. Before, when I said they were a disaster, they retreated into this little Islamic bubble and just really were an absolute disaster when it came to foreign policy. But now they've been talking to China, they've been talking to Pakistan, they've been talking to the Russians as well, and more significantly, the Iranians. And they've even reached out, apparently, to the Hazara, who traditionally have been persecuted ruthlessly by the Taliban. And the very fact that the Sunni puritanicals are willing to sit down and talk to the Shia Hazara and the Shia Iranians, I think, you know, is a really productive sign. But it's not in the interests of Israel, which is playing its shadow wars with Iran in the Persian Gulf, and it's not conducive either to the Wahhabi influenced Saudi Arabia that absolutely hates Iran. So I'm quite fearful that some foreign players will try and destabilize the Afghan government, whatever shape or form it manifests itself. I'm really afraid for that these dirty tricks will be played when you know, the future could be so bright. You know, the revival of the old Silk Road trade route, and you know, Afghanistan has so much potential. Well, I don't have to tell you all that. You know, it's an amazing country, and it could really be a key trading route once again, and productive and rich in mineral wealth as well. It has, you know, the sleeping giant has a chance to wake, but it's really how the others outside, dark forces outside, will react.
Yvonne, there's one point in what you shared that stood out to me that I wanted to kind of see if you can elaborate on it. And it was when you discussed the Hazara population. And so a lot of us, when we have been you know, maybe tweeting or on our social medias, we've been getting feedback a lot from the Hazara community, the Shia community, the Sikh community. So the minority groups that, the Uzbek, you know, the ethnic groups that are minorities. How would you deliver a message for them who they are sharing that they had real scary realities and they don't feel welcome? And they are, a lot of them, you know, actually I think a lot of Afghans are wondering, what if this is a PR stunt because the world is watching? How can we truly trust their message? It's easier, again, me going back from a mental health lens, to say, okay, let's just wait it out. Waiting it out is the realistic thing to do, but that comes with anxiety. It comes with unpredictability. It's like, what would you suggest for regaining trust, or not even regaining, actually gaining trust of the people from the Taliban with the atrocities we're hearing about?
Actions, that's how. We've heard the words, they tick all the right boxes: women's rights, equality, reaching out to all of the ethnic minorities, having an inclusive government. These are all fine words. We need to see action now, and we need to see it very, very quickly. I know the Taliban can move quickly militarily, but when it comes to administrative issues, they've got to, move with lightning speed as well. Only that way will it convince the Hazara, the Tajiks, and the other minority groups that they are wanted, they are valued, they are needed. And this is very important. The whole world remembers the destruction of the 2 or 3 main Bamyan Buddhas. In fact, when I was held by the Taliban, I asked them, why on earth did you do that? And they said to me, we were in a famine. People were digging through the snow to try and find tufts of grass to eat. And the EU had isolated Afghanistan. There was no aid coming in. It was absolutely dire. And then somebody had said, why don't we destroy the Bamyan Buddhas? And suddenly the whole world sat up and paid attention, and were more or less running over the bodies of our starving to say, please don't touch the Buddhas. And so they said, we just thought, you'll do nothing for our people, but you want to preserve some rocks? Well, we'll give you more rocks. And it was a very juvenile reaction to blow up 2 or 3 of the biggest Buddhas. It was cultural vandalism on a terrible scale. And you can sort of understand where the petulant behavior came from, but that isn't how a mature government reacts. And I don't think that they would go down that route again. So, we can speculate as long as we want, but people are not going to feel secure until those words turn into actions.
Thank you very much. So, Yvonne, it was a real pleasure to have you as our guest. I would love to have you as a guest again. I think our audience would really appreciate hearing from you, seeing from you again, because we have so much to discuss for future episodes. So I would really appreciate if you would be willing to appear on our podcast and on our live streams in the future. And I would like to thank Pashtana because it's really amazing to have you as someone who is conducting this interview today for us. So both of you, thank you very much. And for the people who have been with us in the chat, thank you all for joining us today. This was another AFGHANEYE Live. I would like to request you all to press the like button because there are so many of you, but only 7 of you have liked the video so far. And don't forget to subscribe to our channel, and please press the notification bell so that you get a notification whenever we go live. Again, thank you all, and see you again soon. Wassalamu alaikum.
Walaikum salam. Thank you, Sangar.